resolution is that it does not deal with arms control in any practical sense. Instead, it is a vehicle for anti-Saudi rhetoric, the usual tired comments about Yemen, and an opportunity to yet again criticise one or two member states. We all agree that a robust and ethical system of arms control, and in particular licensing, is vital for successful de-escalation of the many conflicts across the globe. Arms sales to non-state actors are a particular concern, and therefore the transparency of end-user certificates becomes paramount. Mr. President, Yemen is a political problem, and peace will only come through dialogue between Yemeni factions, not through the response of international actors. The simple fact is that the international community has outsourced the Yemeni conflict to the Saudi-UAE coalition. We rightly decry the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, whilst ignoring the underlying issues. The UN Special Envoy is doing a good job, but he is constrained by the lack of options on the table due to so many groups being excluded from the talks. Let's properly debate this, rather than this constant cheap point scoring. If we're not prepared to intervene, then surely we cannot deny material support to those who do so on our behalf. As the Houthis deploy ever more sophisticated weaponry, including ballistic missiles fired into Saudi Arabia, the EU is strangely silent on this. Call me a cynic, but maybe it's something to do with European business interests in Iran. If you want real influence, then stop this self-serving rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you.